First of all, just an introduction of me for those of you that might not know who I am. My name is Bhavik Patel. I am an estate planning attorney and a special needs planning expert in this region. I think I've given over 100 or so of these presentations to ARC family. So really appreciate being here and thanks for listening in. Let's start with SSI, Supplemental Security Income, not Social Security income, not Social Security disability income, and not Social Security at all. This is supplemental security income, and I apologize in advance of why they have to use the same letters. Why do they have to? Because it causes a lot of confusion. The first thing about SSI that I want you to be aware of is it's a federal program, but it's administered by the states. You'll get to know my humor through this conversation, but what that really means is that it's pretty chaotic. Uh, it's federally funded. It's federal program like that because it's federally funded, but it's administered by all the states, and all the states have different ways to administer it. And then even within a state, you might get a variety of consistent or inconsistent answers depending on who you're talking to within the state office. What all I have to say is, yes, it is frustrating. It is chaotic. It, you could have exactly the same situation as your neighbor. Both of you apply on the same day with the same exact scenario, and you might get a slightly different benefit from each other. And there's, I guess, the best way I could say is, it's definitely not a perfect system, and it's very messy, but it's still a system that can provide tremendous value to Joey and help Joey meet certain needs that he might have, that would allow for the private funding side to supplement or to provide additional value or support for Joey. So, no, it's not a great system, but it's our system and it's the only system we have. So, there are two big elements that you must prove in order for Joey to receive SSI benefits. Joey must prove that he is disabled. That is done by medical evidence. So if you apply for SSI through that process, you will be approving the state in getting access to Joey's medical records so that they can evaluate and see if that part of this two-pronged test is met. So Joey must be disabled in order to receive SSI. The second element is Joey must prove financial need, that he has financial need. If Joey is under the age of 18, then not only does Joey need to establish financial need, but his parents must also have to establish financial need. And if the parents are married, it would be them collectively. If the parents are divorced, it's them individually, even if they're remarried and all of that. So all of that gets looked at if Joey is under the age of 18. If Joey has reached adulthood, transition from child to adulthood, which is 18 years of age, then they will stop looking at the parents' financial need and they will solely focus on Joey's financial need. We'll talk a little bit more about the financial need tests and what really needs to be passed in order to be eligible for that. But let's assume for a moment Joey receives SSI. SSI is a monetary amount of money that could come in monthly that can range from 0 to approximately $900. That's your range, okay? And some people can get that maximum amount, and some people get something below that maximum amount, depending on some of the things we're going to talk about here shortly. But more importantly than the amount is SSI money is known as restricted money, meaning it must be used for very specific purposes. In particular, SSI should be used for food for Joey and shelter needs for Joey. So paying for rent, where he lives, paying for certain key utilities to allow for where he's living to function, and then for his food, groceries, restaurants, things like that. This is very important to understand because so many of my clients will get the SSI money for Joey and will start spending it for a variety of things, pencils, for example, or paper, or things like that. And though those are all important, needed things, that's not within the rules of SSI. And so if the state decided to audit Joey's benefits and his use of benefits, or if if they had somehow figured out what was going on, that would jeopardize these benefits. So I just wanted to make sure you understood that SSI money should really be limited to food and shelter.
Can SSI be used for a nursing home?
SSI money is, if they're living in the nursing home, that is part of shelter. A lot of times when Joey is in a nursing home, all of the SSI will be allocated to the nursing home, which will then credit it whatever amount the expenses are for Joey. They'll credit the SSI amount. They won't even give you a choice to use it. They'll require that they have to take it. And then they'll hold on to the account and the money and use it accordingly to the services. And then after that, potentially if Joey's on Medicaid, then Medicaid services would kick in and pay the rest.
So how are SSI funds tracked?
So it's no different in your tax returns. I mean, at the end of the day, we're a self-reporting, self-policing sort of government in this sense. So the risk is audit risk. And if you were to ever be audited, they will ask for receipts and records and things like that. And if they're not satisfied, you'll lose the benefits, and the penalties could be severe. If they find that the benefits were used inappropriately, you may close the door to benefits, or be asked to return the benefits, meaning to pay them back all the way up to the full amount. So it can be very severe penalties or future suspension of benefits. So but it is practical to some nature because as you can imagine, not everybody gets audited. Just like the IRS, they can't audit every tax return. This is really no different. It's really difficult to audit every individual receiving a benefit. Now you are filling out an annual report to the state saying that you have used it appropriately and so on and so forth. And so they could get you on even stiffer penalties that deal with perjury issues or things like that. Let's talk about financial need. In essence, there are two tests that determine or that factor into SSI. And if there's one takeaway out of all of this today, this is it. And I'll use a sort of a silly analogy that hopefully you can visualize to help understand how these two tests sort of work together to the land of trying to receive public benefits, and in particular SSI. So picture yourself in front of a locked door. And on the other side of the door is SSI benefits. Well, there are two tests. Let's say one test is the test you have to pass to unlock the door. And then the other test is the test you have to sort of pass to decide how ajar or how wide open the door is going to be. So let's talk about unlocking the door, because you can't open the door if it's locked. You can't receive benefits if that door is locked. When I say locked, I'm really just talking about eligibility. How do you become eligible for SSI? So that test is known as the resource test. And when I just read the name of a test, I become curious. Resource test. So to me, naturally, the first question I ask when I read resource test is, well, what is a resource? I'm going to talk to you about that here. Let's start with a very broad, overly encompassing definition of resource. Anything that can be converted to cash is a resource. Anything that can be converted to cash. It doesn't matter how much cash, it just means that it can be converted to cash. So we're talking about the clothes we wear. Now I'm going to give you some exceptions here, but I want you to start with very broadly, a resource is everything. It's anything that Joey possesses, owns. And mind you, I'm talking about Joey after he's an adult. If it's before he's 18, they also look at the parents' resources. That's a very, very high threshold to meet and get SSI payments while your child, Joey, is a minor. So what exactly is the resource test? What is the number? If Joey's resources exceed $2,000 on the first day of the calendar month in which Joey applied for SSI. So it's May 16th. And if Joey applied today, they would go and look at what Joey's resources were as of May 1 of this month. And they would add up anything that can be converted to cash. And if it exceeded $2,000, the door would be locked, meaning no way to open it, no way to receive SSI benefits. The other thing I'm going to say is, even if at one point you had the door unlocked, and then resources came to Joey after I applied, you in essence have till the 1-year anniversary to make sure you continue to pass the resource test year over year. I would not, however, encourage you to go from $1,000 on the first day, ramp that up to $10,000, and then figure out a way to get it back to $1,000 on the 1-year anniversary. Maintaining public benefit eligibility requires an ongoing discipline of making sure you're not coming close to locking the door, that you're not coming close to violating the resource test. Later on, we're going to talk about Medicaid, and Medicaid has a resource test as well. It's a higher threshold. It's $5,301 for Medicaid eligibility rules for the resource test. I don't want you to ever remember the $5,301. I truly want you to only, even though it's technically not correct, and if you go and talk to friends or talk to a neighbor and you say, I went to a presentation and he said this, and it's technically wrong. I admit it. It's just a safer way to go about it. I only want you to think about the lower number. I only want you to think about the resource test being $2,000 for both Medicaid and SSI. It does you no good to remember the $5,300 number if you're still trying to get the SSI. Okay, remember I said that we're going to start with saying resources is everything. Let's now kind of walk that back a little bit. There is by law certain assets or categories of assets that are not considered resources or are just excluded from the calculation. The first one is a home. If Joey has ownership of the home and he actually lives there, then the entire value of the home is exempt from the resource test. So in other words, Joey could have $100 in the bank, nothing else, and a $500,000 home that he lives in, that he owns. And Joey would still be eligible and would still pass the resource test. Now, this does not mean I want you to take away from that I'm just going to leave my house to Joey when I pass away because it won't disqualify him from public benefits. That is not a part of what we're talking about today, but it's not a good strategy to leave the home to Joey for a couple of reasons. If Joey ends up not being able to live in the house because he needs to go into that nursing home or a group home, or he just needs some more care and he can't live in that house, the moment he no longer lives there, it becomes an accountable resource. And so the $500,000 home now puts you above the threshold, you lose the benefits. So that's one reason why I don't think it's a good strategy. The second reason is if Joey did own a home and then he died, the government, the state, will be able to attach a lien on the house to recoup the costs that it spent for Joey's care. That's called a Medicaid lien. And so through better planning and a more thoughtful planning, leaving the house in a different way for Joey to live there would avoid the lien, which would allow the house then to go to other family members upon Joey's passing, or allows Joey to go in a nursing home and not lose his benefits because he owns this house. Those are much more optimal or proactive strategies. Nonetheless, the law allows you to exclude the home that he lives in for public benefit eligibility or resource test component. Household goods. These are all the things, the stuff, things that don't have title. I will tell you, the state doesn't focus too much on this, but the actual law is household goods in the aggregate not worth more than $2,000 of current fair market value. The problem and the reason why the state doesn't focus too much on this issue is because it's hard to prove who owns the stuff. I mean, it's hard to say Joey owns the iPad versus mom or dad. It's just very difficult. So you could always just say mom and dad own it, not Joey. And now the iPad's market value isn't counting towards the 2000. Nonetheless, I just wanted you to be aware of all the exemptions or exclusions from the resource test. But this is one I wouldn't really focus too much on. The next exclusion from the resource test, which is a morbid sort of asset, but a prepaid funeral. If for whatever reason, let's say Joey had more than $2,000, and so the door was locked, Joey might consider, or Joey's guardian or someone on behalf of Joey might consider to use the money that's above the threshold and maybe pay for a burial plot or a burial space or a prepaid funeral, thus allowing that asset to still stay in Joey's column, but now be an exempt or an excluded resource versus the money that was sitting in the bank account. And so that's an effective strategy in the event that you need to react because you're above that dollar amount threshold. A few more exemptions or exclusions. One is a vehicle, as long as the vehicle does not have a current market value in excess of $4,500. So, I mean, again, my humor, a relatively unsafe vehicle, potentially, or a used vehicle that obviously is dated now for it to be a fair market value of $4,500. However, there is the allowance to have a vehicle that is much more expensive, as long as that vehicle is necessary for the employment or medical treatment of Joey, or it's necessary to perform essential daily activities, then it no longer has that current market value. What I'd tell people is think about like one of those handicap accessible vans. They're customized. They can be as expensive as $100,000, but they could be necessary to transport Joey. Maybe because he's in a wheelchair and he can't walk, as a way of an example. So I just wanted you to know that there is the ability to have a more expensive vehicle, but you have to qualify for one of these exceptions to the $4,500 rule. A life insurance policy that is owned by Joey that has a cash surrender value of less than $1,500. Mind you, this is an insurance policy owned by Joey. So, keep that in mind. This is not a very broad exclusion. These are for particular, what I see it applied to a lot of times is for adults that have become disabled and perhaps already had life insurance in their name. And then if that had cash value above 1,500, it would keep the door locked to public benefits. The last two are not technically in the resource test rules, but they apply because they've been added in other laws that would allow you to create an exemption or an exclusion from the resource test. The first of those two is an ABLE account. An ABLE account is essentially a savings account that Joey can utilize with Joey's assets, or other people can put assets into it. You're limited on being able to save about $15,000 a year into the ABLE account, and the total value of the ABLE account must be under $100,000. So there is an amount to be able to save, but if you save too much, it's going to go back to locking the door. Now, I'm not going to talk a lot about the ABLE account, but I will say in general, the ABLE account would then be allowed to be used for Joey's benefit to take care of him, to supplement his needs. So very similar to a special needs trust and how a special needs trust can be used for Joey, an ABLE account works the same way. Now, I don't want anybody listening to me to go set up an ABLE account for Joey tomorrow. Unless Joey has assets in Joey's name or he's working and so he's making money. Those are the types of things I would put in an ABLE account. Assets that are already in Joey's hands or part of his salary and he's accumulating his paycheck and it's starting to save up and it's getting close to the threshold of 2,000, then moving the amount into the ABLE account is a very effective strategy. I am not a big fan of mom and dad putting mom and dad's money into an ABLE account or putting really anybody else's money other than Joey's into an ABLE account. And the reason for it is Medicaid can also attach a lien on any leftover money in the ABLE account. So I'm kind of a have your cake and eat it too kind of guy. I would rather figure out a different way to save mom and dad's money to provide for Joey, but have it outside the reach of a Medicaid lien or some other kind of reimbursement to the state. And the last one is assets placed in a properly drafted special needs trust. There are, like I said earlier, we have 2 other seminars that talk specifically and only about special needs trusts. So I'm not going to elaborate beyond that. But suffice it to say, there are many different types of special needs trusts. You need to understand those different types of special needs trusts, and you need to understand whose money can go in which type of special needs trust. But for purposes of unlocking the door or having the door locked, assets in a special needs trust will not lock the door. So there could be $10 million in a special needs trust for Joey. And outside that special needs trust, Joey has literally no other assets. Joey's door is unlocked. We have talked for quite a bit here on the issue of unlocking the door. But now let's shift gears to talk about how wide the door can be open. And so we look at the other test. That other test is known as the income test. And again, just like when we were talking about the resource test, we said, hey, a natural, obvious first question is finding out what resources are. Well, when we're talking about the income test, I think we should be asking ourselves, what is income? And there are 3 categories of income. The first one, the one that makes the most sense, is the easiest to comprehend. It's called earned income. And so that's like, clocking in and out, earning a paycheck, your salary. Those are the types of things that are called earned income. So if Joey's working, he's earning income, and that will be a factor in how wide the door is open. Another type of income is known as unearned income. So that's like alimony or child support payments. I'm going to spend a second talking about that. For any of you on this call that's divorced, when you go to your divorce lawyers and you go through and get a divorce, They're not special needs or public benefits experts. And so they're negotiating a child support payment, or whatever, whichever party they're representing. And ultimately, it has led to more loss of benefit. This is one of the ones that leads to a loss of benefit more than almost so many other things, because they have a child support order. Joey's getting $1,000 a month. The moment Joey turns 18, that child support money is deemed unearned income to Joey. And so that could be a problem. That could end up closing the door, so to speak, which is problematic. There is a way to fix that issue. If you're stuck in that issue now, it does involve, in a perfect world, cooperation from an ex to be able to resolve this jointly. And hopefully they're able to put personal differences aside and think about Joey's best interest. But that's not often the case. You could modify or it could be done by actually fighting about it in court, but hopefully by agreement. But ultimately, you would ask the court to modify the child support order to allow for that child support payment to be put into a very specific kind of special needs trust, which would then allow for the benefits to continue while still receiving child support payments. But unfortunately, it's a big area where we see people losing benefits. Another one that you see on that screen there is payments of other benefit programs. So that question about SSDI, that SSDI money that Joey's receiving is going to be unearned income to Joey, which will reduce or eliminate the ability to get SSI money. Otherwise, it's interest earned on your checking account, things like that is unearned income. But the last type of income is the one that surprises people, doesn't expect it. It is called in-kind income and also often referred to as imputed income. The biggest example of in-kind income is if your adult child is living with you rent free, then the state is going to determine some number of imputed income, because otherwise an adult would have to pay to live somewhere. You have a legal obligation to house minor children. You no longer have that legal obligation as an adult child. And so therefore the law says if they're living with you and they're living rent free, then that's considered income. And so we don't need to give you as much SSI money, because SSI money is for shelter, rent, and food. And if you're already getting that for free, I don't need to give you the maximum amount. That's the logic. That's the thought process. I bet you many of you listening in have heard the concept or are already fulfilling the concept of your Joey, who's an adult, paying rent to you as the landlord or the owner of the house that Joey's living in order to avoid this in-kind or imputed income characterization. This is what will also allow you to help maximize how wide the door is open, how much of an SSI benefit Joey's going to receive. I did not give you a very specific formula for the income test, and I'm purposefully not going to tell anybody about that test. One, it changes very frequently. Two, What I want you to hear is any amount of income. Here's what I want you to remember. Income, any kind, any one of these categories, is going to start to close the door. So no income, doors wide open. Suffice it to say, let's say more than, this is not an actual number, but this is the number I want you to remember. More than $1,000 a monthly income, considered a door shut. So 0, wide open, 1,000 shut. That doesn't mean $500 of income means the door is going to be open halfway. And that's why I'm not going to share it. I just want you to correlate Joey's income to being wide open or closed. Okay, so I'm going to pivot from the SSI eligibility rules. But before I pivot, I just want to summarize. You must pass the resource test in order to unlock the door. You must continually pass the resource test in order to avoid the door from becoming locked. If the door is locked, you get no benefits, both Medicaid and SSI. You don't get any of the benefits. If the door is unlocked, you then go to the income test to determine how wide or how much of a monthly benefit you get. That, as I told you earlier, if you take anything from what we talk about today, that's it. Remember the resource test and the income test and the roles that both of them play as it pertains to this analogy of a locked or unlocked door. I'm going to back up for something very specific. As we were talking about the exemptions or the exclusions from the resource test, the exclusions I went through is an exhaustive list. It's not an illustrative list. Another way to say it is if I did not specifically mention it being excluded from the resource test, that means it is included in the resource test. And I say that because oftentimes I'll get questions, I have a 529 or I have a this, do those count? I have gone through every single exclusion. There are no other exclusions I didn't discuss. So I did not mention a 529 plan. I did not mention a CD that my grandmother might have given Joey. I didn't mention any of that. It means those things are included in the resource test. I just wanted to kind of very specifically highlight that is the list of exclusions.